Hello and welcome to a new episode of Defence Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense news and commentary podcast, where we unpack military procurements, events, and broader strategic issues in focused detail so you can build a clear and more accurate big picture. So I have with me, as always, Arslan Khan. Hi Arslan, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you, mate?
I'm doing well. So let's just dive right into it. The headliner for this week is that Pakistan has boosted its defense budget. So the federal government recently announced that the upcoming fiscal budget for the year of 2026 to 2027 includes a near 18% increase over last year's budget for defense. In real dollar terms, that shakes out to about 10.76 billion US dollars. That is the largest defense budget Pakistan has set in real dollar terms, though obviously, when we consider the fact that we are talking about nearly 3 trillion rupees this year, it really shows that, the rupee's weaknesses has really eaten to the has really eaten to the real has really eaten into the real dollar gains. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I think, there's a lot of nuances that are worth exploring there. We didn't get a clear split in terms of, which of the tri-services are getting what exactly. But I think, based on what ARY News has reported, it seems to be fairly standard. The Army, commands about 1.28 trillion. The PAF about nearly about 573 billion, the Navy around 293 billion rupees. And then you have basically for the personnel expenditure about 967 billion rupees, and then 743 billion for operational, and then another 925 billion rupees for physical assets. So basically, there's two sort of breakdowns here. One was between the tri-services, and then the second was where the money is functionally going across all three. So it is worth noting that the physical assets category has seen a 39% jump compared to last year, which usually indicates that there is a bit of a big procurement push happening this upcoming year. But also it's worth noting that, the way platform procurements are done is that the overall cost of the contract is sort of split between the upfront acquisition, which might include like the fighter planes cost, for example, whereas the back half, which is like your maintenance, support, and what have you, tends to be absorbed by the operational budget. So just something to keep in mind there. So, yeah, like basically, I think based on what the PEF had said in its press release a few months back, they're definitely looking for, new platforms. But I feel personally, and Arslan, we can get into it. Personally, I feel that the bulk of this spending is actually going to go into munitions because that's really where the urgent warfighting demand is. So over to you, Arslan.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I don't necessarily think this is one of those things that indicates like big, procurements. I saw the other day people was, suggesting that this is like a forerunner to a J-35 purchase. Like people have been saying, oh, where are the J-35s? And they say, well, here's the biggest evidence you've got for them. And I kind of disagree with that because, in dollar terms, $2 billion isn't particularly much. I think that was the 2 billion was like a procurement budget, I believe, off the top of my head. And if you factor that in, the Pakistan Navy needs to buy new submarines and the new surface vessels. The Air Force is buying tons of SAMs. The Army is doing Army stuff. So it's not, in like real terms, it's not necessarily the biggest thing in the world. But as you mentioned, I also personally agree that this is more of like an indication that the Army and the other forces are probably going even more in on indigenous developments here because, the in your local in the local currency, it's a far more significant number. And obviously, we've seen the creation of the rocket force, and the rocket force seems to kind of allow the other forces to like stem off of it. So, for example, we've also seen the Navy pick up rocket force munitions, adapt them to their needs, and I also think we'll see the Air Force do the same thing as well. Adapt some rocket force developments to their needs. So it's kind of like a massive. It seems more like a massive push on indigenous munitions more than anything. We saw we spoke about this last time. The cost of a Chinese range extension kit being $100,000, or I think it was $150,000, something like that per unit.
No, it was $1 million per unit when we
Wow.
imported it. Yeah.
So the same as a CM400 AKG in effect. So yeah, so stuff like that. You're not going to have this issue anymore because firstly, with the biggest problem with Pakistan has always been the scale of munitions. Right, we've never seen. We've always wondered like how many in Arsenal do we actually have them? We've always estimated to be low double digits, maybe 20, 30, 40, very low double digits of certain types of munitions like cruise missiles, a specific cruise missile like the Rad or whatever. So we've always assumed it to be quite low, limited numbers. But with the rocket force, we can clearly see that their idea is to expand on these numbers. And on top of that, we've seen a ton of missile tests this year. We just had two missile tests last week. So we've seen a ton of missile tests this year, which is kind of a little bit more indicative of the increase in production quantity as well, right? Because they're not going to be testing missiles they don't have to test. So them continuously being able to expend missiles is quite indicative that they've probably got a bit more money and a bit more stockpiles to use, but also the fact that they're continuously developing on them. We've seen Fatah 4, which is the Barber series, evolved. We've seen a new intake, we've seen new seeker option, we've seen new warhead, new fusing, different guidance stacks. So we've seen, just in this last couple of months, we've seen these significant changes and in the same way, we've seen the same thing go for Rad. Like we've seen so many different iterations all in the last couple of months, more than we've ever seen in Pakistan's history. So it's clear that they're pushing a ton of investment into this indigenous munitions stack. And logically, the only next hurdle is scaling the production up. And to scale the production up and also to scale the stockpiles, you need money. And that seems to be the case here.
Absolutely. And I would just also shout out that when it comes to indigenous munitions, like compared to, let's say, let's even take take the JF-17, for example. We have PAC basically headlining that they basically manufacture or co-produce the fighter within Pakistan, which is true. But the issue is that almost all of the upstream inputs, like the alloys, the engine, the electronics for the avionics, they all come from abroad. So the issue is that if you're even in that context, you're very much tied to the limits of how many dollars you have. In contrast, when it comes to munitions, a lot of the munitions value chain is actually has been indigenized within Pakistan. Like we take for example the Fatah series rockets, right? You can definitely see everything from like the aerostructures of it, the solid fuel composition, the rocket motors, all being built within Pakistan because it's just a generally simpler design than compared to the JF-17. The main things which are probably being imported are everything tied to the electronics, but that makes up a minority of the missile's overall value, right? So in this case, using the rupee and the rupee, increasing defense budget in rupee terms takes you much, much, much further. Obviously, there are probably some fixed overhead costs in relation to expanding the production output. So new factories and what have you, they definitely draw on imported systems, but again that cost is going to get amortized over years and decades, so that's not the big issue. However, I think we'll probably start seeing more and more jumps in the defense budget over the next few years to basically build that deeper munition stockpile. However, there's still a story for additional platforms. It's just that they're not going to be as many because right now the priority is to make sure that the platforms that we have are leveraging a sufficient stock of munitions to begin with, right? That's like the first order of priority. However, I think the fact is there was another report where the federal government has started to basically request, I would say, firmly request the provinces to also basically help with defense spending. So at one level, it's not a great story in the sense that they are basically sort of digging deeper into the existing pool of resources. On the other hand, I think for those who follow Pakistan's, economic news and fiscal news, they would know that in general, provincial spending, especially in certain provinces over others, is not well controlled and audited to begin with. So I don't think the money that is coming out of or going to defense is necessarily affecting much on the ground, or it probably is. Or to be fair, it probably that's if someone's going to take money out of somewhere to fund defense, it's going to be from social, healthcare and education. But obviously, there's a much bigger, deeper conversation there where you just lack controls at the provincial level. You obviously lack some controls at the federal level. I think the big point to take away is that I argue against the idea of the dichotomy where you're taking money out of development and putting it into defense. I think that's an erroneous framing because number one, look at the environment that Pakistan lives in. You're literally surrounded by multiple contested zones, right? Which are very volatile, and you have an adversarial relationship with two of them, and they haven't shown much of a willingness to, in my perspective, to offer an equitable deal to Pakistan regardless. On the other hand, the other issue that you have is that as as we noted earlier, the controls, like the spending is not audited or held, the spending is not audited at any level, meaning that put another way, there's such a heavy level of corruption that goes in generally. It's not as if Pakistan is running so efficiently that we know that every dollar for defense is going to take away from development, right? The issue is that there's a lot of money in the middle that's just not being controlled correctly. right? And that ties into a much, much bigger conversation. But my simple point is, and we have like a more detailed Quwa Plus article already published, but the real point is that, there's a lot of work that can be done in terms of reforming how things are spent, reforming the way our country is organized. I personally don't believe in the provincial system. I believe in smaller units with more delegated devolved authority to the local governments. I think that would help quite a bit. I also, for example, there are other aspects such as just escapes me right now. But the one other aspect is that even within our federal spending, we have issues in terms of debt servicing and stuff. We don't use our foreign policy gains adeptly enough to help offset those issues, and just many other factors that clearly make this a much more difficult proposition than it needs to be. So that's basically my basic argument here, is that just keep that in mind. However, simple point is that there will be more funding for platforms coming down the line. I think the PEF has basically stated that they're looking for additional J10s and JF17s, so that's coming down the pipeline. But otherwise, I would say at least 60 to 70% of any defense budget increase is probably going to go into building the munition stockpile. So we can go up to the next topic. So finally, the first of the 8 Hangor-class submarines has finally arrived in Pakistan. The first one, PNS Hangor. I think we spoke quite a bit about the submarine program, what have you. But Arslan, do you have any additional points or insights you want to touch on?
There's not really a whole lot to touch on more than what we've already done. I mean, the other thing is on the Pakistan side. I mean, it seems like maybe we'll see PNS Tasneem launch within the next, year or two as well. So, and we'll continue to see the deliveries coming from China. And I also know that I keep saying, and some people had some stuff to say about that. But yeah, so I'm sure we'll start to see more of them flow in. And once this project, I think once these submarines are done, potentially we could even see like some parallel development of Pakistan Navy submarine fleet. Like we saw the SWATs tender, of course, and we've not really heard anything from them on that front. But we know that Fincantieri has opened up shop in Pakistan, and I think they had mentioned that it would take 8 years for the first sub to be constructed. I don't know if that was correct or maybe I'm hallucinating, but basically the first construction of the submarine would take quite a long time for the first unit, which makes sense. It's the first of a conceptual design. So we could potentially see that Pakistan Navy sign contracts for the next sort of next submarine program, for the SWATs, and then potentially soon after that the next generation submarine program, because the Khalid-class, even though it's just been MOU'd, but it's getting quite long in the tooth, and the stuff like the system like Mesmer isn't exactly as well suited. And I want to emphasize is that I talk in relative terms. Like, when I say loud, I'm not saying it's loud. I'm saying it's loud relative to, something like a fuel cell, for example, or even Sterling in this case. But, the system like Mesmer is getting quite long in the tooth. It's basically the French took their nuclear submarine propulsion stack, and they replaced the nuclear bits with liquid oxygen and hydrogen, I think it was, to create the heat, which spins a turbine and all that sort of stuff. But the problem with Mesmer is there's a lot of moving parts. It's very, very maintenance intensive. There's a lot of moving parts. It's also quite an inefficient system as well in its power production, even though it does have higher power ceilings than a Stirling system, for example. So you'd have faster subsurface propulsion, and you'd also have it's just a much more powerful system, but it's just not necessarily as suited for modern. Well, I mean, I guess it's relative. It's all relative, but it's not necessarily the cutting edge that's available to Pakistan. I'd probably argue that something like the Sterling system is probably going to be a little bit quieter, a little bit stealthier. But then Mesmer does also have its merits. As I said, it's much faster, much more powerful. So yeah, it's kind of like maybe we'll start to see the Khalid class, stick one foot in the grave type thing soon.
Yeah, so the first big point is that we're going to start seeing probably more Hangor class inductions over the next coming months and next couple of years. So I think by 2030, the submarine program, this acquisition run is going to be completed, hopefully, even inclusive of the Karachi shipyards boats as well. So I think by the latest 2032, we'll have all 8 boats in service with the Pakistan Navy, at which point you have, the 11 AIP equipped submarines. And not only that, but they're all going to be equipped with, electronic support measure systems and what have you. So in peacetime, they're going to play they're going to basically densify the Pakistan Navy's electronic intelligence coverage or ELINT coverages. So that's going to be spread across your your drones, your offshore patrol vessels, your corvettes, your frigates, your Sultan and Sea Eagle, maritime patrol aircraft. So in that sense, the Pakistan Navy is building a very dense and, I would say like a fairly world class electronic intelligence element that's going to go into that's going to help contribute towards their peacetime buildup. That being said, on the other hand, with the Hangor-class and also in relation to that, the SWATs program. So the Pakistan Navy officially, has mentioned the SWATs a couple times. There was a press release a couple years ago where they literally said SWATs are coming. So that to me was an indicator that they signed a contract and it's in motion. Obviously, I think given the nature of the SWATs, both in terms of the role it's supposed to play and also how it ties into the submarine building Navy vision, I think they've really kept it under tight wraps. I mean, even the whole thing about us saying it's been Kinteri is basically a good inference, but obviously the Pakistan Navy is keeping everything very, very, very close to its chest here. I would say that things will start becoming clearer when they're ready to obviously announce that they have the SWATs, but just right now they're I think until that first boat is built and is fully tested, and maybe not even until it's inducted, they're not going to necessarily say anything about it. I think in relation to it though, where things can also get interesting and we might hear more information as well, is in areas like unmanned underwater vehicles. We know that again the Pakistani private sector has been kind of looped into developing those solutions for the Pakistan Navy. The Pakistan Navy has shown a lot of interest in them. And I think one area, as like, if we look at the SWATs program, there's one side of it where you kind of expand upon it to build a larger, 1,000, 1,200 ton, maybe, conventional attack submarine. That would be our original submarine project to replace the Khalid class, the Augusta 90Bs eventually. But on the other hand, I think you can also go in the reverse where it's like you can also use it as a basis to develop smaller underwater, unmanned underwater vehicles like XL size, about 100 tons or so, which is another interesting aspect, which I think is also worth keeping an eye on because the Pakistan Navy has shown that it is definitely studying quite a bit of, the emerging warfighting trends, for example. So those are the two things I would also keep an eye on. One thing that would be good or interesting to see is that how soon the Pakistan Navy wants to maybe pull an Augusta 90B from service, like maybe the PNS Khalid, because my sense is that because of the way the MESMA AIP system is architected, there might be an interest at some point to start. Yeah, I don't know. Naval Group has kind of stopped supporting it, and if it becomes too difficult to maintain and operate, as a normal warfighting system, there might be like someone might try to make the case that, hey, why don't we just pull it in and, once the SWATs are ready, we just pull this one in and use it for, let's say, experimental and testing purposes, if you catch my drift. So that'd be worth watching as well.
Yeah, and actually, we've seen some, the degradation of capabilities. Actually, I mean, people probably won't like to hear this, but the Pakistan Navy submarine fleet is no longer what it was in in the 2000s. Right? We've seen one of the Augusta 70s is basically out of service. The other one is kind of limping around, and the submarine forces sort of time at sea has been relatively low. But again, it's it's of no fault of the Pakistan navies, but it's just the fact that Naval Group and the French have stopped supporting the program because of obviously the more lucrative Indian market. And as you said, yeah, Mesmer is a quite an interesting system, and it does erase some interesting areas for experiments. Mesmer is basically in its working, it's basically like a nuclear propulsion system, just minus the nuclear stuff. If there was some development of an appropriate small modular reactor, Mesmer is basically all of the downstream stuff needed by the Pakistan Navy to turn it into an actual nuclear propulsion system for a submarine.
Absolutely. And we know, and definitely, to design and develop, even based on that, a nuclear submarine is not by any endeavors a cost effective or low cost, project. However, I think compared to 10 years ago, the situation has changed somewhat. I do feel that, I mean, you have Turkey, which is very openly, clearly saying that they want to develop a nuclear power submarine. I mean, that's one potential partner right there. But also, the Saudis as well. I think they're also interested in exploring the idea. So the point being is that folks caught the pulse check episode or even the preview with Dr. Mansoor Ahmed. The point being is that Pakistan has like a genuine nuclear R&D base, right? I know a lot of folks, both within and without, love to sort of hammer it into Pakistan and Pakistanis and sort of saying, what did you guys achieve and what have you, and everything's from China, but not really. If you just follow the documentation, you'll find that really PAC, Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission, is a real factor. It's just that yeah, they are limited in what they can do due to the lack of funding and a lack of access to uranium and what have you. But when those two things are lifted or are not as much of a bottleneck, then I think we'll start seeing some pretty interesting work from there as well. So I think yeah, like an interesting point in time to keep an eye on. And obviously, the other aspect is I think I've also heard from some retired officials, but maybe not from the Pakistan Navy, but let's say like from the Pakistan Army, retired officials that the PN has the Pakistan Navy has the documentation and know-how about the Hangor-class. So the idea of them experimenting a little bit in original design work through it, like maybe selecting their own choice of vendors for the upstream inputs and what have you, it might come sooner. So they might not necessarily be solely waiting on the SWATs line. I mean, that's definitely one. I think that's it's a necessary track for achieving a certain type of capability. I think the original submarine project, in one aspect, is going to aim for something, an approximation of the size of the Augusta 90B, but with better emphasis on being silent. But I think them continuing to work on the Hungor is also not out of the realm of possibility. So there's a lot of cool stuff that the Pakistan Navy is, poised to do, and I think it's definitely worth watching. But yeah,
And the other thing, just to touch on really briefly before I forget again, is that obviously we've been talking about indigenous munition production being expanded. But submarines, particularly torpedoes, and the other weapon systems on board as well, are very very costly. For example, the DM2A4 the Pakistan Navy uses on its Augusta class, those are $3.5 million each. To equip a boat. With a full set, whatever the combat loadout is, you're probably talking double digit millions, maybe even, yeah, I'd probably say double digit millions. But then when you expand that across a fleet of like 11 to 18 at some point, maybe in the future, that's a lot of money. And we know that the Pakistan Navy has UUV programs. We know they have lightweight torpedo programs, which ties into the Sharper series and the Sharper 3 being used as a naval drone, as an anti-submarine warfare asset. We also, I'm pretty sure, I don't know if I'm, again, I don't know if I'm hallucinating this or not, but I recall there being a heavyweight torpedo program as well. So it's like, it just all ties back in. The Hangars aren't just a submarine purchase, but they're also a deeper investment into Pakistani industry and Pakistani local munitions, because the reality is that you won't be able to sustain purchases from China for stuff like weapon systems, stuff that you need to do, but like spares and support, yeah, fair enough. But weapon systems are stuff that can be localized and indigenized very relatively easily compared to the submarine, for example. So we'll probably see continued further investment as part of this program into the Pakistan, into NRDI's research and development facilities, to be able to develop, firstly, again, a domestic torpedo program. I think will eventually make its way onto the Hangars as well. But I think in its current form, this is a guess, of course, but I'd assume that the Hangars come equipped with YJ-18s, which sort of tick that supersonic missile box for the time being, but they're not really an optimal solution. Like they're a very interesting missile, but I wouldn't really say that they're exactly what the Pakistan Navy needs, because, for example, with the way the YJ-18 works, it's basically it's funny. It's kind of like a plane in the sense where, and the missile itself and the forward section is basically the bomb, right? So what it is you've got the rear end, which is the wings and the fan and the wings and the motor and the fuel assembly and whatnot, carries carries the warhead, the rocket portion for basically most of the flight at subsonic speeds really, really low. And then it detaches from the front section, and the front section is basically a rocket. It's a rocket. I don't know if it's a ballistic. Yeah, I don't know the details, but it's a rocket, and that detaches and that flies, at whatever speeds. Well, it flies at supersonic speeds, higher up or lower, or whatever. So it's not like the most ideal solution. It's basically kind of like a really, really jerry-rigged kind of solution, but it's a very capable missile. But the point is the Pakistan Navy will always have that requirement for a domestic supersonic, hypersonic missile program, and I think that's the other sort of angle they'll look here is how much of the munitions can we localize and develop at home as well. And I think the Hungars are a clear signal of the investment into local production facilities and munitions.
Building off that, I'd be interested in seeing how far the Pakistan Navy is willing to kind of push the private sector into some part of this, because there's this one aspect where if you're going to continue investing in, UUV or AUV technology, you might as well branching from there look at basically long range torpedo programs as well, because I think the principle is very similar, where basically your long range torpedo in some aspects would essentially be a very complex UUV or AUV, right? In the sense that it would have its own smart autonomous operating capability. It would know how to potentially know how to stalk a target before it goes at it. Like there's so many different aspects to that. And I think if, not if, I mean, given the fact that we do have several private sector players already designing solutions for the Pakistan Navy in this regard, I'm sure NESCOM is doing something as well. I think the optimal approach for the Hangor might actually be that in terms of the anti-ship role, right? Basically, where you have these like more complex, very long-range torpedoes, which are autonomous, they operate autonomously and can even double as, off-board sensor slash, ISR systems as well if need be. So I think that's like another interesting aspect. And again, like it's kind of interesting to see that the Pakistan Navy has sort of been this like real probably the strongest pusher of original platform development. Like I know with the Pakistan Air Force, you'll have original subsystems, right? Like you'll have original inputs as part of a existing program. Like for example, in the air defense field, they have original radars and what have you. But I think the Pakistan Navy goes all the way where they're like for due to like reality, due to the constraints that they have to work with in terms of the market, they have to go out and essentially configure their own maritime patrol aircraft, go out and potentially configure their own naval helicopter in the future. So I think there's a discussion here that the Pakistan Navy has sort of become like the skunk works bureau of the Pakistani military in a way.
Yeah, I agree with you with that.
Yeah, so the next topic is a bit unfortunate, but we're not going to dwell too much on the immediate news point, but rather discuss the wider just like narrative around it. So there's a Pakistan Army Mi-17 helicopter loss a while back. The ISPR said that the helicopter had crashed during takeoff due to a technical fault. That can mean any number of things. So without any further substantiation, we're not going to delve into that. So we're not going to go into the specifics of this particular issue. However, I think it's worth sort of broadening things out a little bit in the sense that, what's happening with Pakistan Army Aviation. I do think, my perspective is that the Army Aviation Corps has been somewhat, I don't want to say neglected, but rather I think it's just that General Headquarters hasn't quite figured out where to place Army Aviation, right, as a force. So if you look at the history of Army Aviation, you'll notice that a lot of their biggest growth periods had come when there was an availability of both external military aid and impetus in terms of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations. So the first big move towards building the Army's helicopter capabilities happened around in the 1970s following a counterinsurgency operation in Balochistan where Iran had loaned out a number of its helicopters, including apparently I think some Cobras as well. And from there, the Army Aviation was quite impressed with the capability and had pressed GHQ to essentially start acquiring similar platforms from the US in the 1980s. And then, from there again, it was mostly quiet until the 2000s, again, on the back of the US led war on terror stuff, basically. So to support the Army's major counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations through the late 2000s, early 2010s, a large number of, Bell 412s, for example, surplus Cobras, and then even some Mi-17s from Russia were procured to help with that. But what you notice that outside of those periods, we never really saw a sustained investment in Army aviation. And for the most part, the Pakistan Army has largely kept Army aviation as this really somewhat niche, not well-defined force and hasn't really been investing a lot into it. Like even when you look at, for example, the current Z10 stuff, up to this point, we really have seen only one Z10 ME, right? And it seems that the Army Aviation is still testing it and evaluating it more so than anything. Now, someone might come out and ask, well, Bilal, if what you say is true, then why did the Army order 30 T-129s from Turkey back in 2018? Well, my answer to that is that, the Turks had offered a very good deal. Not only did the Turks try to keep the price of the T-129 as low as they could, like based on the limits that they were dealing with. But the Turkish government had footed a loan to finance them. So the Turkish government basically paid Turkish Aerospace to build the helicopters, and Pakistan would just pay Turkish Aerospace with each batch as it gets delivered. So when the US blocked Turkish Aerospace from transferring those helicopters, Pakistan didn't have to pay anything. It was a no-risk deal. And not only that, but Turkish Aerospace, they even planned on investing in Pakistan with a regional support center for training and MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul. So the idea was that, not just for Pakistan, but any third-party users of any Turkish Aerospace helicopter, their maintenance, training, and all that will be done within Pakistan. So in a way, some of that money that Pakistan would have spent on the helicopters would have come back to Pakistan in the form of an investment. And this sort of also ties into the critique that we kind of leveled on China 1 or 2 episodes back where we said, hey, like, with the Chinese, like, don't assume that they do things out of purely goodwill. There is a bit of a transaction happening. So what we get from them is what we pay for, right? So just to juxtapose that, what the Turks did with the T-129 was that on the they gave us a good deal on the price of the helicopters. They themselves provided a loan. They foot the initial payment for the loan so that, the helicopters get built. And they wanted to then, whatever money that, we've paid them, some of that money we've returned in Pakistan as a form of investment in our aerospace industry. And any of the resulting work share, it would have been exported out of Pakistan, basically, meaning that we would have gotten even more returns through it from foreign exchange returns, basically. So, and, there were even reports, I remember Aviation Week talking about it, that there were even reports of discussions about a possible assembly plant for the T-129s being under consideration in Pakistan because of the deal. As per Turkish Aerospace back in 2016, the general manager of Turkish Aerospace, he said that the Pakistani T-129 requirement was pretty big. So it was like well beyond the 30 that they originally signed on to. Now, when you put all that into perspective and consider how today you have the Philippines, Nigeria, Bangladesh all buying the T-129, there would have been a world where had the program gone through, Pakistan would have been servicing those helicopters. So this is what we're talking about, right? Like the win-win scenario. That was something the Turks were able to push and sort of, lead along. And to its credit, the Pakistan Army Aviation really, tried pushing the ball through, right? But unfortunately, without either the American approvals for the engines or the Americans cutting off the aid money, which would have been used to finance the 1Zs, you notice a very consistent trend that GHQ doesn't seem to prioritize national funding towards Army aviation, right? So during this period, in the last few years, a lot of the funding went into things like the VT-4 tank or the Heather program or the SH-15 howitzer. So now that's on attack helicopters. Now you can imagine what's happening with transport helicopters. And I mean, again, as I'll just repeat it, it just kind of boils down to GHQ just not quite figuring out where and how to use Army aviation. Yeah, I'm going to miss a few key points, but the point being is that, look, at the end of the day, Army aviation, it grew on the top of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, and they never really grew out of that role, right? The Army headquarters just didn't imagine a bigger role for Army aviation. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe now it's different, but at least until up to this point, it seemed that they're just kind of still within that old traditional older architecture. So we have an upcoming article on the Quwa website about this, but the general point is that my personal perspective is that I think GHQ should start viewing Army aviation as an instrument of air power, meaning that, it's less about being just a close air support thing that you would call in for counterinsurgency, but more of playing certain roles that require the Army aviation to be there. So, for example, those roles could include things like rapidly mobilizing and sending troops with air support to the border, right? It could include low-level standoff range attack, right? It can include support for combined arms maneuvers. So in that context, you can bind Army aviation into like things like, for example, the light commando battalions for air assault operations. You can start designing or using like, cruise missiles like the Rasook 250 or jet-powered loitering munitions from Army aviation so they can start doing low-level attacks at standoff range. You can maybe develop new manned-unmanned teaming solutions with, having crewed or manned gunships at the center coordinating unmanned rotary drones, for example, for anti-armor, anti-infantry operations. So basically sort of rethink how to deploy them. And obviously, some folks might say, well, are attack helicopters, for example, even valid in today's modern warfare environment? I mean, after all, in the Russia-Ukraine war, the Ukrainians were shooting them down with man pads and FPV drones. But the thing is that was in the context of the Russians using it in a more traditional air support role. When the Russians moved their attack helicopters back and used them as like low-level standoff range deployment platforms, they actually saw quite a bit of success out of that approach. And to the point where the Ukraine is trying to emulate the same strategy by acquiring the AH-1Z Viper. So again, like attack helicopters haven't gone away, it's just that their role has changed. And again, requires sort of rethinking how GHQ can start using Army aviation in a more like, let's say forward-facing way. So, my perspective when it comes to, and then we're sort of going on a tangent with attack helicopters, but this issue is about transport helicopters. My perspective, and I think our readers and listeners always know this, is that I love scaling. So scale matters. And I think one of the challenges that the Army aviation has right now is that they have like multiple different platforms. Like you have the Puma, you have the Bell 412, you have I think some UH-1s kicking around. You obviously have the Mi-17, Mi-171s. And there's, although on paper they have like there are different size categories, they sometimes seem to take on overlapping roles. Like you'll see both Mi-171s and Pumas taking on the troop transport role, right? You see Mi-171s and UH-1s sometimes take on the logistics role. Like, I mean, it's a lot of mixing happening where with very different platforms that each require their own parallel maintenance, support, and training infrastructure. So my perspective is, you know what? Let's rethink this from first principles. Let's try merging as many of these different platforms into one requirement, into one core platform. And I think, you generally settle on a 9 to 10 ton utility platform, similar in size to like the Blackhawk, for example, or the AW149, or if you want a Chinese example, like the Z20. Just think of the way the PAF replaced the A5s, F7Ps, and many Mirages with the JF17. It's the same idea. You'd want to consolidate these multiple different platforms into one, so that you can generate a consolidated requirement, right, which you can start leveraging. So in this case, you would have a requirement from like 100 to 150 helicopters right off the bat. And why is that number important? Well, when you start going to the negotiating table, you have like a real number to play with now, right? You're going in as a potential customer for 100 to 150 units spread over 10 to 15, 20 years. Not mind blowing, but still a good number is going to catch the attention of the OEM. And then from there, you start to negotiate your deal, right? Like, yes, there's going to be a loan component, but then you go in and say, look, I want offsets that come back into my economy. We can make them targeted offsets. You can, jointly invest in a private sector company that can then jointly produce parts of this helicopter within Pakistan. I don't care about final assembly. I'm not here to showboat or or like sell my population on some story. What I want is a certain percentage of the parts of the value being re-exported out of Pakistan. So I want to integrate the Pakistani aviation industry or aerospace industry into the wider supply chain, and that's what this helicopter purchase is going to be about. In addition to our operational requirements, and if you really want to stretch things, you try to bring in the Air Force and Navy into this. Like, the Navy still has an outstanding utility helicopter or multi-mission helicopter requirement. I think, interestingly, again, the Navy has a similar issue, like not similar, but the Navy has been depending a lot on a Sea King. So to consider replacing a Sea King class helicopter, you might actually need like a 9 to 10 ton platform. So if you can bring in the Navy, and to the extent the Air Force, the private sector, the government services, the Ministry of Interior, bring in all these guys, you might have a requirement for 150 to 200 helicopters now, right? And now that puts you on the map for sure with potential OEMs, and that gives you a lot of leverage to sort of negotiate a good deal that ties in the upfront acquisition with your maintenance support, with some turnkey transfers, like knowing how to train for example, training being done within Pakistan, to then some commercial layer, integration, like providing support for third-party customers, and also obviously, building parts, spare parts, possibly some sub-assemblies, and re-exporting them out to third-party users. And this is what India typically does on its end, and that's why Indian contracts take a longer time to negotiate and settle, because of a lot of these different workings. But I think you're the army, like I don't think the army has an argument out of this. Like, what are you going to argue? You're not prioritizing the army aviation right now, so the delays shouldn't be a problem to begin with, right? That's one aspect, and the other aspect is that the benefits of this approach, are quite extensive. They cut across both, from an operational standpoint and a commercial industry economic standpoint. So, you're not short on time on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it's the benefits outweigh the risks of a delay, because you yourselves are not really pressing on this to begin with. So that's my approach on the whole helicopter side of the equation. I think it's a space worth watching, but let's see how we manage it. Like, my fear is that we're just going to kind of repeat the same cycle where we buy like a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and army aviation is kind of kept below its actual potential. So we have a couple of audience questions. So if you're not noticing Arslan, he had to step out. So I'll basically be carrying the podcast from this point on. So up next, or we have a couple of audience questions I want to sort of get into. The first was, basically to sort of unpack Pakistan's electronic warfare capabilities. This was from the Tayyib Farid through email. So, I think this will deserve its own dedicated episode. I'll try to bring in a theme for this one. But, the general idea is that I would say this, like, I don't want to, because if I was to go into this in detail, it'll take like the whole hour. It'll take like an hour plus. But I would say this, the way you want to frame it is that each of the tri services is trying to aim for the following three capabilities, right? In peacetime, they want to build their electronic intelligence capability. So what that means is that they're going to use a mix of assets depending on the service arm and what their operational environments are. So for example, the Army will primarily be using land-based systems. The Navy will obviously be using sea-based systems, but also some airborne systems. The Air Force will be using airborne and land-based systems. In terms of airborne, the Air Force will be using both manned and unmanned platforms. But the whole idea is from the electronic intelligence side of the equation is you basically are monitoring the battle space, the environments, the regional area for all sorts of electromagnetic radio emissions. So that would be things like your radar emissions. There would be things like communication emissions from the enemy, other countries. And basically, you start to just record and track those emissions and their frequencies and what have you to build what you call a threat library, right? And ideally, you would have all three not ideally, I think this is what the military is actually doing, is that because some of the equipment is actually sourced from the same domestic vendor, which is NESCOM, right? So obviously NESCOM is seeing all this information come through from all the service arms. NESCOM, the NRTC, and NASTAP. So NASTAP works within the Air Force, so that might be a bit of a silo there, which they have to work around if they haven't already. But otherwise, if it's the NRTC and NESCOM, then obviously those guys are definitely seeing all the information coming in from all the service arms. But the idea is that they're basically building the threat library. And this threat library is basically the reference manual where our active emitters, which are our jamming systems, are going to be using to essentially interfere with enemy radars or spoof their radars or interfere with the communications. So if you ever wondered how the PEF was ostensibly, and I know our Indian listeners are going to scoff and look the other way on this one, but let's just go with the information. When the PEF goes around and says that it has jammed Indian communications, this is the workflow, right? So in peacetime or in like whatever the current status quo is, you have different aircraft, land-based systems, sea-based systems, basically monitoring the Indian side of the airspace to see what the communication frequencies look like. They record all those frequencies and put them into a threat library. When it's wartime, the active, electronic attack, electronic countermeasure systems then use that threat library, the frequencies within those to start basically rebroadcast that frequency to the Indian side in an attempt to basically jam their systems. That's a very crude and basic explanation of electronic warfare as a whole. There's a lot of technical nuances, which I would love to bring Asim to sort of unpack. But that's the main idea. And then obviously, even within wartime, you have a situation where you will have, you'll see your enemies, active emissions, which is basically their electronic attack attempts, their additional radar emissions as well. Like, for example, in May 2025 was probably the first time you had fighters on both sides just, broadcasting in their radars. You had active ESA radars on both sides of the border. So I think a lot of that information has probably been recorded and now is being parsed. And obviously the technology itself it's continuously advancing because it does tie in quite a bit with what's happening in the software space. So you have like AI and machine learning elements also being incorporated to help parse and organize the data. I know I have to double check, but I do recall reading, it's not in relation to Pakistan, but more generally, maybe from the US or China even. But I do recall reading like extrapolative techniques where you have an AI basically looking through your threat library to extrapolate what a potential non-registered emission could look like. So this stuff is basically getting into like several degrees of advancement basically. So yeah, that's like just the crude explanation of it. It does work the other way as well. Like we're just kind of mentioning what Pakistan's capable of, but India is doing the same thing. I mean, I think we have to keep that in mind, right? India is engaging in this exact same workflows and what have you. So the effects work the other way as well. So it's always worth keeping in mind and seeing how the defensibility aspect of the discussion is being managed. So that's where you get into your electronic countermeasures, right? So your ability to overcome electronic attack and countermeasures, basically techniques. And that's like a whole other ballgame, which is not my strength or an area I have personally looked into as of yet in a lot of detail, but that's definitely something to also get into. So hopefully we'll have a scene come in the next 1 or 2 weeks to maybe unpack that. The next question is from Farhan Faizi. How can the Pakistan Navy upgrade its naval coastal missile force with supersonic and hypersonic cruise and ballistic missiles to form a credible threat for the Indian Navy? So, I mean, I think this is one of those situations where the answer is sort of embedded within the question. Like, obviously, you would want the Pakistan Navy to induct supersonic and hypersonic cruising missiles and obviously anti-ship ballistic missiles, ideally longer ranged ones as well. You could argue, if you want to be really aggressive about it, that this is also when it comes to the maritime environment, because it's just that much more expansive of a situation where you might even want to invest in hypersonic glide vehicles, right? For example. So that's where, I would say the Pakistan Navy would prefer looking towards. Obviously, what it can actually procure is going to depend entirely on the technology that's available to it, whether that's domestic or from China or from other places. I think obviously we should expect them, similar to Fatah 3 from the Army, expect them to also invest in supersonic cruising missiles. In fact, the Navy's been the first one to induct those through the CM302. So maybe one solution could be that they either buy coastal batteries of the CM302 or they potentially acquire a anti-ship version of the Fatah 3, which is most likely the HD-1 missile anyways. On the hypersonic cruise missile side, I mean, obviously that's like a whole other ball game. That entirely depends on Pakistan's access to, you know, scramjet technology. I don't think that's on the cards at all at the moment. I think really the priority would be to develop, the supersonic cruising capability further. Right now, it's really concentrated within the four Doggerel Type 054 AP class frigates. So I think either again the Navy gets a large stockpile of CN302s for land-based operations, or they basically piggyback on the Fatah 3 and have like a, similar to the Smash sort of is basically based on the Fatah 2 platform. Now, that being said, one other aspect is that you want to build out the over the horizon targeting capability. That's where I think it's one thing to have the munitions sets, and I think definitely you want to emphasize the ability to, engage targets at higher speeds and velocities and also at longer ranges. But to make use of the range, you need over the horizon situational awareness and targeting capabilities. And that's where I think it gets interesting because, I think the traditional approach would have been to invest in over the horizon radars. I find it interesting that the Pakistan Navy hasn't really stepped into that any level that we know of. I believe there might have been a project in one of the MODP disclosures a few years back suggesting it, but it never really said over the horizon radar. So that's one aspect to keep in mind. If not a traditional over the horizon radar, I would at least expect maybe the Navy to maybe invest, or commission the NRTC to develop like a early warning radar, similar to the kinds of radars the Israelis use for their, Arrow slash, David Sling based systems. So again, it's like it gives them high altitude, but also over the horizons. And what we mean by over the horizon, just to be clear, is that your ability to essentially pick out what's happening over the curvature of the Earth. So if you see how a radar works, basically, your standard radar, when it projects forward, because the Earth is round, right? I hope we all believe in that, right? But because the Earth is round, there'll be like basically gaps between what the radar can show as you get further and further away from the radar. So, because think about it this way, like no matter what, the radar is always sort of pointing upwards in a way. And this is a very crude explanation, so you have to forgive me. But basically, the radar is going to be projecting upwards or up basically. And the issue is that because the Earth is round, as you get further and further and further away from the radar, you basically have this gap that keeps building out. That gap is basically your radar blind spot, right? And the way the Air Force would typically build or fill out these blind spots is where they would have like a long range radar. They would fill out, the area with shorter range, lower level radars in front of the long range radar. So that would help fill in the blind spots, basically. Similar issue for the Navy. So the Navy would have to invest, if it wants to build that, region level anti-access area denial capability, it would need to invest in an over the horizon radar, which basically, or let's say over the horizon capability, which either involves a dedicated OTH radar, which works in a very particular way, or basically like the Air Force, you just build, forward sensor nodes to essentially fill out the blind spots. One other method would also be through maritime patrol aircraft like the Sea Sultan and Sea Eagle. So, you obviously the Shepherd 3 drones as well. So you have those flying about to basically help cover those blind spots or, to extend the range coverage as well. So you have basically a combination of different sensor, rather different radar nodes that would essentially extend your ability to see what's happening at sea, right? And to also target those different threats. The other side of it is that I would say, like, besides coastal missiles, I think one other aspect to look into, and it could be interesting as well in relation to countering the Indian Navy, is also you want to build up your, let's say near coastal naval assets. So I think one area the Pakistan Navy has been investing quite a bit in is right now it's mostly in the testing phase, but it's basically unmanned surface vessels. Basically, I think one scenario is that you could see unmanned surface vessels sort of fill out the creek coastal adjacent areas as well to prevent similar Indian vessels from intruding. So that's another aspect you want to keep in mind. Or you can also keep USVs as sort of like a last layer of defense where they sort of, if you look what happened in Ukraine, they sort of operate as basically kamikaze boats, which threaten incoming amphibious landing ships and what have you. So that's another thing you want to keep in mind. So definitely, I think it's not so much like how can the Pakistan Navy do upgrade its missile force. It will. And again, like definitely we'll see it invest more in longer range anti-ship ballistic missiles. You'll see it invest in supersonic cruising missiles in that regard. I think the interesting question is how it'll handle the over the horizon surveillance and targeting net. Like will it invest in a dedicated over the horizon radar? Will it invest in early warning radars? Or will it take more of a distributed, disaggregated approach where it sort of splits out radar coverages through many different individual assets? And I think that's something to keep an eye on. I'm not sure how it'll approach it. I think the temptation is that it might look to emulate China in every respect and invest in those big over the horizon radar capabilities. But the problem is that it becomes like the target sticks out at that point, right? So India will just target those radars in an attempt to basically neutralize the Navy's situational awareness and targeting capabilities. So I think it reasons, if you were to use that as a reference point, I think it reasons that the Pakistan Navy will just focus on disaggregating and distributing situational awareness as much as possible and rely on a more complex, network enabled posture to sort of bring all that information together. And obviously, you also have another aspect, which is the attempt to build the satellite constellation element. So that's another entire thing in development as well. So you have the upcoming PISAT program, but even I think it was like an American observatory noted that even the current Pakistani satellites, the PRSC EO3 and PRSC S1, are sort of operating in a bit of like this yin yang formation where one sort of covers South Asia or the region, our region closely during the day, and the other sort of comes back and covers it during the night. So, and the whole point is to achieve like a near daily refresh rate. So again, there's a lot of work happening in the space side as well, which is also going to tie into this. And then last topic for this I guess solo cast half of the podcast. So the French-German FCAS project, the Future Combat Air System, has basically collapsed. France and Germany just couldn't see eye to eye on it. And at least on the main sixth generation fighter platform, they've sort of parted ways for different reasons. And the reason why I thought this was an interesting topic was that it essentially brought up, if you watch the Indian defense discourse, it brought up the possibility that maybe France could approach India to co-develop, sixth generation fighter aircraft. And it's funny that would come up because it's something that I theorized as a possibility on two occasions. Once in just March of this year, and then also a few years earlier, where I said that basically that, for India, and I mean, when I discussed it a few years earlier, it was on the back of the Indians formally withdrawing from the Su-57 at that time. I figured that, if India was serious about, its next generation ambitions, that yes, they have the AMCA project, but if they want, they would probably look further as well as China had, and look at a sixth generation option. And maybe the FCAS could be an area of interest, but there are a lot of challenges because, you would basically be like the fourth or fifth partner at that point. And securing things like technology transfers and, joint R&D and, work share production or production work share would be more difficult. But now, with France needing a funding and R&D partner, I think India being in that conversation is definitely plausible, right? There are a lot of caveats to that because at the end of the day, and again, like, this is just my personal opinion and reading of how I view the Indian defense industry sphere. But I sort of see India's defense industry, let's say defense industry environment, split into three camps, right? You have one camp, which is the Indian Air Force, which is very much focused on its immediate operational requirements, as it should be. They have a very rigid and narrow perspective, very similar to the Pakistan Air Force, where for them, is a platform ready? When can we receive it? How good is it reliable? Does it meet certain operational requirements? The Pakistan Air Force has near identical requirements as the Indian Air Force, right? If you even think about it, the reason why Pakistan never designed and developed a fighter aircraft is because, at one level, the PAF just, yes, there's a lack of fiscal resources, which obviously played the biggest role. But the other hand is that, yeah, like the PEF just did not trust I don't want to say did not trust. I mean, that gets into a bit of a heated discourse, but it's just they have air headquarters has a rigid perspective, right? They're just focused on the immediate need because they perceive that there could be a war at any moment, right? So it's no different for the Indian Air Force. So they're going to prioritize the platform that's already active, inducted, and ready to go, right? Then you have obviously the state-owned Indian defense industry. And I feel like if you look through their history, they work hand in hand with the Indian government, particularly Congress, the Congress Party over the decades. And they liked working with Russia, right? Russia has been pretty flexible and has given some concessions in the way of technology transfers. Obviously, like because of the scale of the Indian Air Force's programs, when those programs get routed through, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited or what have you, it creates a impetus for the wider industry to invest in like critical industries like gas turbines, alloys, and what have you, which then helps, HAL basically start sourcing inputs indigenously, which is why you have, feasible portions of the Su-30 being built in India, right? Even the AL-31 series engines, or maybe I'm not sure if it's the AL-31 or the RD-33, but one of those, or maybe both. Many parts and components and inputs are sourced from within India from scratch, right? So it definitely says something that approach has helped, right? India build its aerospace industry both at the downstream, which is HAL, which has a contentious relationship with the Indian Air Force, to say the least. But at the other end, at the upstream, which is then, ties into their other stuff, like their missiles, their submarines, what have you. Like, alloy investments can go a long way once you're able to get past the first few bottlenecks and hurdles. And India's managed to get past those hurdles. So there's definitely something to say in regards to that. But at the same time, I don't want to say cost, but the trade-off is that you have a lot of business units, entities, people who rely on that work share, right? They want the work that they're familiar with. They want to work with the partners they know. They know what Russia is going to bring to the table, right? In a production sense. They know what the Russians are going to transfer. They know what kind of work they're going to get. And yeah, like, when India, whenever those elections come around, I mean, those actors and those stakeholders have a voice for sure. And then there's a third group, which is, I think ties into the private sector quite a bit, but I actually give them more credit. And I feel I kind of view them as like, the nation builder mentality, which is something I hold now increasingly, where you have a group of people or group of companies and groups who want to see India compete at a global level, right? They want to see India, sort of throw its leverage around. They want to see India sort of enter the big league of nations. Like this, they have like a vision for India. And that's why I see programs like the AMCA come up, the Tejas come up, right? That's where you see like, I think it also stems into India's nuclear program, their missile programs, their submarine, their naval programs. I think they've been traditionally strong players in the naval sphere. As you can see, the Indian Navy expanding quite a bit, like the surface fleet really benefiting from that growth and outgrowth. And I think those folks have a vision that India should take charge. India should be in the lead, right? There should not be money going out into footing other people's R&D projects, like in Russia or France or what have you. And that's the third group. And they have like a vision that, India, they have like I think like a vision that ties industrial development, economic development, all that kind of stuff all together. To see India as an exporter, to see India as like as one of the big arms dealers of the world, right? So there's that group. So you have these three forces, basically, each having a voice on the matter, right? So obviously, like this is why Indian programs, especially like the fighter aircraft stuff, they slow down. And essentially, this is one of those things where the reason why the FCAS gets interesting is that the French can sort of speak to all three, right? The FCAS doesn't exist right now, right? There's no sixth generation fighter right now. And the reason why that's an important point is because there's nothing for the French labor class to lose. And if you notice in the last episode, I discussed how, I felt that the reason why the Rafale negotiations were stalling, and they're probably stalling in relation to work share, was because that the French government just could not like concede on work share due to the fact that that their local labor is a very volatile political force, and once they they need local labor on their side in order to continue to win elections. Basically, the advantage with the FCAS is that there's no work there right now. Everything is net new. And you can go back and make the argument that, hey, instead of spending $100 billion alone on this project, right, we can have India spend 50 billion, split the amount. And yeah, we would have to split the work share accordingly. However, this is net new work share, right? This is going to continue the French industry. This is how this is going to, it's much more complex. It's going to require more people, right? A 6th-generation fighter is not a joke. It's much more complex than the Rafale. Like, I think they have that latitude. So for the French audience, the French government, Dassault and Thales and Safran Group, all these guys can basically make that argument domestically. Then on the Indian side, I think you go to the Indian Air Force, if you're the French, you can say, hey, look, continue advocating for the Rafale. Let's get this deal through the door. We know that it doesn't appeal as much to the Indian defense industry right now, but we're going to tell the Indian defense industry and both the state-owned and the private sector that there's more to gain in an FCAS program later, that we are going to finally, on the private sector side, we're going to help you finally nail down an original engine program. We're going to help you with the upstream developments. We're going to help you with this and that, and you're going to be part of the big leagues, right? You'll own the FCAS architecture and re-exporting rights and what have you in Asia, Middle East, you name it, right? And then on the state-owned side, it's more like the traditional stuff. Like, hey, like we can now guarantee some of that work share. It can go through, HAL, what have you. So I think, and obviously, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on how the Indian defense industry works. This is just me reading from the outside, but this is how I sort of see how this could become plausible. It just depends, because the thing is that if you pull in all three of these players into the conversation, like in the Indian Air Force, the state-owned public sector and the private sector defense industry players, you're going to have a lot of voices you have to sort of deal with, right? So there's an aspect where things can slow down and get delayed and all that kind of stuff starts to come back in. But I think when you're from both, but what I think is, like, if you're the IAF, if you had a development part, if you could bring in a development partner to help your domestic industry, whether it's HAL or the private sector or both, you would probably prefer the French, right? You'd probably prefer the Americans, right? So I think there's that aspect of that as well. So yeah, like that's just some few cents of mine on that. Obviously, as you notice, if you're tuning in at this point, Arslan is not with us right now. He had to drop off, but in any case, I thank everyone for listening once again, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye.